There is a country in the world that is mentioned more than 200 times in the Bible. A country whose king was the only man outside of Israel to receive from God the title of anointed, the same title given to David, the same title given to the Messiah. A country that saved the Jewish people from total extermination not once, but at least twice. And most impressively, this country was prophesied by name more than 150 years before its greatest feat, by a prophet who never set foot in that land. This country is not Egypt. It is not Greece. It is not Rome. This country is Iran. And if that surprised you, get ready. Because what you are about to discover here will completely change the way you read the Bible and how you look at the Middle East. When someone mentions Iran today, most people think of geopolitical tension, nuclear programs, or conflict with Israel. But what almost no one knows is that the relationship between the land we now call Iran and the biblical text is one of the oldest, deepest, and most surprising in all of Scripture. And we are not talking about vague mentions. We are talking about Persian kings called by name, about royal decrees transcribed word for word within the sacred text, about entire books of the Bible set in Iranian cities that still exist today, about prophecies written centuries before the events and fulfilled with a precision that makes historians scratch their heads. To understand this story, we need to go back a long way, much further than most imagine, because the connection between Iran and the Bible does not begin with Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. It begins in Genesis. At the beginning of everything, open the book of Genesis to chapter 10, and you will find the so-called Table of Nations, the list of Noah's descendants who, according to the biblical text, gave rise to all the peoples of the earth. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It is from Shem that the term Semite comes, and it is the lineage of Shem that generates both the Hebrews and the Arabs. But there is a detail that almost no one pays attention to. Genesis 10 verse 22 lists the sons of Shem, and the first name on the list is Elam. Elam. This is the oldest name for the land we now call Iran. The Elamites were one of the first organized peoples in human history. Their capital was Susa, yes, the same Susa that appears in the books of Esther, Daniel, and Nehemiah. The same city where, centuries later, a Jewish queen would save her people from annihilation within the palace of the greatest empire on earth. But we are getting ahead of the story. What matters here is understanding the weight of this. According to the Bible, Elam, the ancestor of the Persians, was the brother of Ashur, who gave rise to Assyria, and of Arphaxad, who is the direct ancestor of Abraham. This means that, within the biblical genealogy, the Persians and the Hebrews are cousins. They descend from the same patriarch. They share the same Semitic lineage. They are not distant strangers. They are family. And the Elamites were not just extras in ancient history. Quite the contrary. Genesis 14 records the first war mentioned in the Bible, and guess who is leading the military coalition? Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. This Elamite king commanded an alliance of 4 kings that dominated the region of Mesopotamia and the Jordan Valley. He was so powerful that 5 Canaanite kings had to unite to try to resist, and they failed. Chedorlaomer I sacked Sodom and Gomorrah and took prisoners, among them Lot, Abraham's nephew. It was this crisis that forced Abraham to mount a military rescue operation with only 318 trained men from his household. 318 against the coalition of the most powerful king in the region. And Abraham won. Notice what is happening here. In the first war recorded in the Bible, the antagonist is an Iranian king. The power of Elam was already so great in Abraham's time, we are talking about approximately 2000 BC, that he controlled kings from the Iranian plateau to the shores of the Dead Sea, a sphere of influence that covered nearly 2,000 kilometers. This is no minor detail. The Bible is telling us that the land of Iran was a power from the very beginning, but Elam was only the beginning. Because within that same region, another people was forming. A people that does not appear in the table of nations by that name, but who would change the course of biblical history irreversibly. The Medes. The Medes occupied the northwest of what is now Iran, in the mountainous region around the city of Ecbatana, modern-day Hamadan. And if the Elamites were the ancient power, the Medes became the prophetic power. Because when God wanted to announce the destruction of the greatest empire in the ancient world, it was to the Medes that he pointed. Isaiah chapter 13, verses 17 and 18. Read carefully. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. Their bows also will dash the young men to pieces, and they will have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye will not spare children. This prophecy was written around 740 BC, and it is not talking about just any nation. It is announcing the fall of Babylon, the most magnificent empire the ancient world had ever seen. Its 12-meter-thick double walls, its hanging gardens, its temple of Marduk gleaming in gold, all of this, Isaiah says, would be destroyed. And God's instrument for this destruction would be the Medes. Jeremiah reinforces the same message decades later. Jeremiah 51, verse 11, "Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord has raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his purpose is against Babylon to destroy it." The kings of the Medes, plural. Because when the prophecy was fulfilled in 539 BC, it was not just one Median king who attacked Babylon. It was an alliance, Medes and Persians united under a single leader. And here is where the biblical history of Iran transforms into something that has no parallel in any other civilization mentioned in Scripture, because this leader had a name, and that name appears in the Bible more than 150 years before he was born. Cyrus, in Hebrew, Koresh, in Old Persian, Kurush, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the man who created the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point, stretching from Egypt to India, covering more than 5 million square kilometers. Get an idea of the scale. Cyrus's Persian Empire was larger than the entire current European Union. And it was not just large, it was administered with a sophistication that Rome would only achieve centuries later. But what makes Cyrus unique in the Bible is not the size of his empire. What makes Cyrus absolutely singular in all of Scripture is what God said about him. Open to Isaiah 44, verse 28, who says of Cyrus, "He is my shepherd, and he shall perform all my pleasure, saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid." And the following verse, Isaiah 45:1, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have held." Stop, reread that. God called Cyrus my anointed. In Hebrew, the word is Mashiach, Messiah, the same word used to describe the promised deliverer of Israel. And God is using this word for a pagan king, a Persian, a man who did not worship the God of Israel, who, according to historical records, likely followed Zoroastrianism, the religion of Zarathustra. Even so, God calls him my anointed and says that he takes him by the right hand. If you believe the Bible is what it claims to be, the weight of this is overwhelming. No Pharaoh received this title, no Assyrian king, no Babylonian emperor. Nebuchadnezzar, whom God called my servant in Jeremiah 25, did not receive the title of anointed. Cyrus did. An Iranian received the most sacred title in the Hebrew tradition, and this was no accident. If this surprised you as much as it surprised me while researching, comment, "I didn't know." Now, the most disturbing detail of this story, the matter of the date. Isaiah wrote these verses around 700 to 680 BC. Cyrus was born around 600 BC. Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC. This means that the prophet Isaiah wrote Cyrus's name and described exactly what he would do: free the Jews and order the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem, at least 140 years before the event happened. And it was not a vague prophecy. It didn't say a king will come from the east. It said the name Cyrus. It said what he would do: build Jerusalem and found the temple. And it said how. By God's direct choice, who would take him by the hand. This is one of the strongest prophetic arguments in the entire Bible, and it does not depend solely on faith to be evaluated. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay artifact found in 1879 in the ruins of Babylon, now on display at the British Museum in London, independently confirms that Cyrus did indeed conquer Babylon and adopted a policy of liberating captive peoples and restoring destroyed temples. Archaeology and the biblical text align with a precision that bothers any honest skeptic. But how did Cyrus come to power? Because this story is so cinematic, it seems like fiction. Cyrus was born around 600 BC in the region of Anshan, in southwestern present-day Iran, territory that belonged to ancient Elam. According to Herodotus, the Greek historian, Cyrus's grandfather was Astyages, king of the Medes, which would make Cyrus half Mede, half Persian. A fusion of the two most powerful Iranian lineages. The legend Herodotus records says that Astyages had a prophetic dream in which his daughter gave birth to a vine that covered all of Asia. Terrified, he tried to kill his newborn grandson, but the child was saved and raised in secret by a shepherd. If this story reminds you of something, a king trying to kill a child destined to change the world, the child being miraculously saved and growing up in anonymity, it is because this pattern repeats in the Bible: Moses, Jesus, and now Cyrus. When Cyrus grew up and discovered his true identity, he did exactly what the dream predicted. He rebelled against his grandfather, united the Persians and the Medes under his command, and in 550 BC took Ecbatana. Within a decade, he conquered the kingdom of Lydia in present-day Turkey, defeating the legendary King Croesus, whose wealth was so famous that to this day we say rich as Croesus. Then came Babylon, and here is where the biblical prophecy materializes before our eyes. In October 539 BC, Cyrus's armies arrived at the gates of Babylon. These were the most famous walls of the ancient world. Herodotus describes walls nearly 27 meters high, so wide that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top. The city was considered impregnable. Decades earlier, Nebuchadnezzar had transformed those defenses into a masterpiece of military engineering. Any rational general would look at those walls and turn back. Cyrus did not try to scale the walls. He did not try to break them down. He did something no one expected. According to the accounts of Herodotus and the Cyrus cylinder itself, the Persians diverted the course of the Euphrates River, which cut through the middle of the city, passing under the walls through bronze gates. By diverting the waters, the river level dropped enough for Persian soldiers to enter through the riverbed under the walls, with the water only waist deep. Babylon fell in a single night, practically without a fight. Daniel chapter 5 records this very night, the night King Belshazzar was holding a banquet, drinking wine from the sacred vessels stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. A hand appeared out of nowhere and wrote on the wall, "Mene, mene, tekel, parsin," numbered, weighed and divided. That same night, Belshazzar was killed, and the kingdom was given to the Medes and Persians. Exactly as Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesied, a fulfillment so surgical it seems choreographed. And what Cyrus did after taking Babylon is what forever cemented Iran's place in biblical history. In 538 BC, less than a year after the conquest, Cyrus issued a decree that is recorded in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. He declares, and the biblical text preserves his words, The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has commanded me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is among you of all his people? May his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord. This decree did not just allow, it ordered and financed the return of the Jews to their land. After 70 years of exile in Babylon, exactly as Jeremiah had prophesied, the Jews could finally go home. And who opened the door? An Iranian king, not a Jewish prophet, not an angel, a Persian emperor who likely never read the Torah, but who fulfilled to the letter what was written in it more than a century before he was born. Think about the absurdity of this for a second. The Jews were captive in Babylon. Their prophets said they would be liberated. The liberation came, but not by internal revolution, not by direct divine intervention like in the Exodus, plagues and the sea opening. It came through a bureaucratic decree from a foreign monarch. God used the geopolitics of the ancient world as an instrument of redemption, and the vehicle of that redemption was Persia. It was Iran. Ezra records that Cyrus did not just release the captives, he returned the 5,400 gold and silver utensils that Nebuchadnezzar had looted from the temple in Jerusalem. Every cup, every bowl, every censer, everything catalogued, everything counted, everything returned. Ezra gives the exact number. This level of detail is no accident. It is the biblical text saying, this happened, there is a record, there is an inventory. And it wasn't just the decree. Cyrus's policy toward conquered peoples was radically different from anything the ancient world had known. Assyrians and Babylonians deported populations, destroyed temples, and erased cultural identities. Cyrus did the opposite. He allowed each people to maintain their religion, their language, and their customs. The Cyrus Cylinder, which many historians consider the first declaration of human rights in history, explicitly declares this policy of tolerance. For Jews, this was not just political freedom. It was theological confirmation. It meant that the God of Israel was sovereign over history, so sovereign that he could move the heart of a pagan king on the other side of the world to fulfill a promise made centuries before. Isaiah 45:4 and 5 says directly to Cyrus, "For Jacob, my servant's sake, and Israel my elect, I have even called you by your name. I have named you, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. There is no God besides me. I will gird you, though you have not known me. Though you have not known me." Twice God repeats this. Cyrus was not a believer. He did not worship the God of Israel, and yet he was used as a central instrument of the divine plan. If that doesn't make you stop and think about how God operates in history, I don't know what will. But Cyrus was only the first act. Because the history of Iran in the Bible did not end with the liberation from exile. In fact, the three Persian kings who came after Cyrus are equally fundamental, and almost no one talks about them. The first is Darius I, also called Darius the Great. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple, neighboring peoples opposed the project. Threats, letters to the Persian government, attempts at political sabotage, construction stopped for years. Ezra chapters 4 to 6 detail this conflict. The Samaritans and other groups in the region sent a formal petition to the Persian king asking for the work to be stopped. The matter reached Darius, and what did Darius do? He ordered a search of the royal archives. They found Cyrus's original decree in the records of Ecbatana, and Darius did not just reconfirm the authorization, he issued a new decree that was even more emphatic. Ezra 6:8-10 records that Darius ordered the costs of reconstruction to be paid in full by the Persian royal treasury, with money from Iran. The taxes paid by the peoples of the Western Euphrates financed the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. a Jewish temple erected with Persian money by decree of an Iranian king. And Darius went further. He threatened that anyone who tried to stop the work would have a beam pulled from their own house, be impaled on it, and their house would be turned into a refuse heap. Ezra 6:11. This was not timid support. It was absolute imperial protection. And thanks to this protection, the second temple, the temple that Jesus knew, which was later expanded by Herod, and which was the center of Judaism until 70 AD, was completed in 516 BC. This temple existed for nearly 600 years, and it would not have existed without Iran. If you understand that God uses entire nations as instruments of his plan, comment, "He is sovereign." The second fundamental Persian king is Artaxerxes I. And here, the biblical history of Iran gains two chapters that most people know but never connect with Iran. The first is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was not a prophet, he was not a priest, he was the king's cupbearer, but not just any king, the king of Persia. Nehemiah lived in Susa, the Persian capital, serving Artaxerxes I personally. His job was to taste the wine before the king drank it, a position of absolute trust because it meant the king placed his life in this man's hands every single day. And one day, Nehemiah received devastating news. The Jews who had returned to Jerusalem were in a miserable situation. The city walls were still in ruins. Without walls, the city had no defense, no dignity, no status. It was a cluster of houses vulnerable to any attack. Nehemiah wept, he fasted, he prayed, and then he did something extraordinary. He asked the Persian king for permission to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. Nehemiah 2:5-8 records the moment. Artaxerxes not only granted permission, he gave him letters of authorization to pass through Persian territories safely, orders to local governors to provide materials and timber from the royal forest for the gates and structures. Once again, a Jewish project financed and authorized by Iran. And Nehemiah did the impossible. In just 52 days, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. Nehemiah 6:15. 52 days to raise walls around an entire city. The enemies around them were so shaken that the text itself says, "When all our enemies heard of it and all the nations around us saw these things, they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God." The Persian hand opened the way. The divine hand completed the work. But the most dramatic chapter of the Iranian presence in the Bible was yet to come. A story that happened in the corridors of that same palace in Susa, involving a Persian king, a Jewish queen who hid her identity, and a genocidal plot that nearly wiped the Jewish people off the face of the earth. The story of Esther. If you have heard this name, you probably think of a Sunday school children's story, a beautiful queen who saved her people. But what actually happened in that palace in Susa is one of the tensest, most politically complex, and most theologically disturbing narratives in the entire Bible. And it takes place entirely on Iranian soil. Every scene, every dialogue, every conspiracy, everything happens within the Persian Empire. The Book of Esther is, from beginning to end, an Iranian story. The king in question is Ahasuerus, whom most historians identify as Xerxes I, the same Xerxes who invaded Greece, who fought at Thermopylae against the 300 Spartans, who built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont Strait. This is the man, one of the most powerful monarchs to ever exist. He ruled 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Esther 1.1 make sure to open with that number. 127 provinces. And the administrative capital of this colossal empire was Susa, today the city of Shush, in the Khuzestan province of southwestern Iran. The ruins of the palace where this story happened are still there. You can visit them. The book begins with a party. But not just any party. Esther 1:4 says that Ahasuerus held a banquet that lasted 180 days, 6 months, displaying the riches and glory of his kingdom to the nobles and governors of all the provinces. White and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rings and marble pillars. Couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Esther 1:6 describes this with a wealth of detail that makes you smell the incense in the hallways. This was the world where Esther's story would unfold. A world of such extreme opulence, it seems like fantasy. But archaeology confirms it. French excavations in Susa, led by Marcel Dieulafoy in the late 19th century, found exactly the types of columns, pavements, and ornamentations that the biblical text describes. During this festival, Ahasuerus sent for Queen Vashti to display her beauty before the guests. She refused. The king's advisors panicked, not because of the personal insult, but because of the political precedent. If the queen can disobey the king, they said, all the women in the empire will do the same. Vashti was deposed, and this created a vacuum. The throne of the Queen of Persia was empty. To fill it, Ahasuerus ordered that the most beautiful young women from all 127 provinces be brought to the palace. A selection process that lasted 12 months, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and ointments, an entire year of preparation before each candidate had a single night before the king. Among these young women was a Jewish orphan named Hadassah. Her Persian name was Esther, derived from the Persian word stara, which means star, and which some scholars connect to the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. She had been raised by her cousin Mordecai, who held some kind of administrative position at the king's gate in Susa, and Mordecai gave Esther an instruction that would define the entire narrative. Do not reveal to anyone that you are Jewish. Esther 2:10. This instruction was not paranoia, it was survival. The Jews were a scattered minority within the immense Persian Empire, with no land of their own, no army, no political power. Their safety depended entirely on the goodwill of the monarch, and goodwill, as history teaches, can evaporate overnight. Esther was chosen. She became the Queen of Persia, the wife of the most powerful man in the world, and no one knew she was Jewish. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Every meal in the palace served with food that likely violated Jewish dietary laws. Every Persian religious ceremony attended in silence. Every day lived with a false identity inside one of the most heavily guarded power centers on earth. Esther was not just a queen, she was an infiltrator. And that infiltration was about to become the only thing between her people and total annihilation. Enter Haman. The biblical text identifies him as Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. That last word is crucial. Agagite. A descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites, the ancestral enemy of Israel. The same people who attacked the Israelites when they left Egypt, whom God swore to fight from generation to generation in Exodus 17. Haman was not just an ambitious politician. He carried in his blood an enmity that was centuries old, and Ahasuerus promoted him to the highest office in the empire, above all other princes. Everyone at the king's gate bowed down to Haman, everyone except one man, Mordecai, the Jew. Esther 3:2 says simply that Mordecai would not bow or pay him homage. The text does not fully explain why. Perhaps it was a religious matter, not bowing before anyone but God. Perhaps it was the ancestral enmity between Benjamites and Amalekites. Whatever the reason, Mordecai's refusal ignited a fury in Haman that would not be satisfied with the death of a single man. Esther 3:6 says that Haman thought it beneath him to kill only Mordecai. When he discovered that Mordecai was a Jew, he decided to destroy all the Jews in all 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. All of them. Men, women, children. in a single day. This was not a local pogrom. It was a decree of imperial genocide with planetary reach by the standards of the time, because at that moment, the overwhelming majority of the world's Jews lived within Persian borders. If the decree were executed, practically no Jew would be left alive. Judaism would be exterminated, and with it, the lineage that would produce Jesus of Nazareth. The scale of what almost happened is so monumental, it is hard to process. If Haman had succeeded, there would be no Christianity. There would be no Islam, which recognizes the Hebrew prophets. The religious history of half the planet would be erased, all because of one man who refused to bow before another man at the gates of an Iranian palace. Haman convinced Ahasuerus with a brilliant and poisoned political argument. Esther 3:8 and 9. There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. And he offered 10,000 talents of silver to the royal treasury, an amount equivalent to approximately 340 tons of silver, to finance the extermination operation. The decree was drafted, sealed with the king's signet ring, and sent by couriers to all the provinces. Esther describes the content: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. The decree was published in every language of every province, and verse 15 of Esther chapter 3 ends with a sentence that is one of the most chilling in the entire Bible. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. They sat down to drink. The king and the architect of genocide sat to have wine while the capital of the empire went into shock. That sentence alone says more about the banality of evil than entire volumes of philosophy. And while Haman drank, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out crying through the city. In every province where the decree arrived, the Jews went into mourning, fasting, weeping, wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. An entire people feeling the weight of a death sentence signed by a man they had never seen. It is at this point that Mordecai sends the message that defines the entire book of Esther. When Esther hesitates, because approaching the king without being summoned meant risking her own life, even as queen, Mordecai responds with the most famous words of the book. Esther 4:13 and 14. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? For such a time as this. Every step of Esther's life, her orphanhood, her adoption by Mordecai, her beauty that caught attention, her selection for the harem, the crown, all seemed like chance. But Mordecai is saying, what if none of this was chance? What if every detail was strategic positioning for this exact moment? And here is a detail most people don't notice. The book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions the name of God. Not once. There is no "thus says the Lord." There are no visible miracles, no sea opening, no fire falling from heaven. Everything that happens in the book of Esther can be explained as coincidence, political maneuvering, or luck. And that is exactly what makes this book so powerful. Because the book of Esther shows how God operates when he seems absent. Behind the scenes, through circumstances, through human decisions, through a young Jewish woman who found the courage to risk her life in the throne room of a Persian king. Esther decided to act. She asked all the Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. And then she did what no one expected. She did not go directly to the king with an accusation. She invited him to a banquet, and then another. 2 dinners, with Haman as the only other guest. The strategy was so subtle and so brilliant that Haman did not realize he was being led to his own destruction while thinking he was being honored. During the second banquet, the king asked, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" And Esther finally revealed everything. Esther 7:3-4. "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." Ahasuerus was furious. Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther pointed, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Esther 7:6. The text says Haman was terrified. The king went out to the garden, enraged. When he returned, he found Haman fallen across the couch where Esther was reclining, likely begging for his life, and interpreted the scene as an outrage. "Will he even assault the queen while I am in the house?" says verse 8. And then one of the eunuchs mentioned that Haman had prepared a gallows 22 meters high, originally intended for Mordecai. The king gave the order, "Hang him on it," and Haman died on the gallows he himself had built. The irony of this outcome is so perfect, it seems written by a novelist, not a historian. The gallows Haman raised for Mordecai became his own sentence. Haman's 10 sons were also executed, and Mordecai, the Jew who refused to bow, was promoted to the position Haman held. The king's signet ring was transferred. A Jew was now the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire. But there was a legal problem. The decree of extermination had already been published and sealed with the royal ring. And the law of the Medes and Persians was irrevocable. Not even the king could annul a sealed decree. Daniel 6:8 confirms this legal principle. So Ahasuerus did the only thing possible. He authorized a second decree. Esther 8:11. The Jews were given imperial permission to defend themselves, to gather together and fight for their lives against any force that attacked them on the 13th day of Adar. And they fought. And they won. Esther 9 records that in Susa, the Jews killed 500 men who attacked them, plus Haman's 10 sons. In the provinces, they killed 75,000 of those who rose up against them, and the text makes a point to note 3 times that the Jews did not touch the plunder. Esther 9, 10, 15, and 16. This repetition is intentional. Centuries earlier, King Saul, also from the tribe of Benjamin like Mordecai, had lost his throne because he took the plunder of the Amalekites when God commanded him not to. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Now, facing another Amalekite, the Jews did differently. They did not touch the plunder. The historical correction is so precise, it seems purposeful. This victory gave rise to the festival of Purim, celebrated to this day by Jews in the month of Adar, in memory of the liberation that happened in Persia. The name Purim comes from the Persian word pur, which means lot, because Haman cast lots to choose the day of the massacre. The final irony, the lot Haman cast to destroy the Jews, became the name of the festival that celebrates their survival. And this festival was born in Iran. Every time a Jew celebrates Purim anywhere in the world, in New York, in Tel Aviv, in Buenos Aires, they are celebrating something that happened on Iranian soil, inside the palace of a Persian king, because of the courage of a Jewish woman who lived in Iran. And there is one more layer most do not see. Jewish tradition claims that the tomb of Esther and Mordecai is in Hamadan, Iran, ancient Ecbatana. There is a structure there, venerated for centuries, that is considered their burial site. It is one of the oldest Jewish shrines in the world, and it is in Iran to this day. A Jewish mausoleum, maintained and preserved in Iranian territory, reminding the world that the connection between the Jewish people and the Persian people is deeper and older than any modern conflict can erase. If this story made you see Iran in a completely different way, comment, "I didn't know this." But the presence of Iran in the Bible is not limited to historical narrative. It invades the realm of apocalyptic prophecy. And this is where the story gets even stranger. Because the book of Daniel, written within the Persian Empire by a Jew who served under Babylonian and Persian kings, contains visions that mention Persia both explicitly and in code. Daniel chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Daniel has a vision of a ram with two horns standing beside a river. One horn was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. The ram pushed westward, northward, and southward, and no animal could withstand him. And the angel Gabriel appears and interprets the vision. Daniel 8:20. The ram which you saw, having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. The two horns, two peoples, Medes and Persians. The higher horn that came up last, Persia, which began subordinate to Media but ended up dominating the alliance. The pushing in three directions, Cyrus's conquests to the west against Lydia, to the north against the Medes, and to the south against Babylon. Every detail fits with a precision that critics try to explain by dating Daniel to the 2nd century BC after the events. But even that attempt does not eliminate the fact that the text is there, preserved, transmitted, and read by millions for millennia. And in the same vision, Daniel sees a goat with a large horn coming from the west, which Gabriel identifies as Greece, that attacks the Persian ram and destroys it. Daniel 8:21, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great, who in 334 BC marched against the Persian Empire and in less than 10 years destroyed it completely. Daniel's vision describes this in detail. The goat comes from the west without touching the ground. The speed of Alexander's conquests was so absurd that the ancients said his armies flew, and the large horn breaks at the height of its power. Alexander died at age 32, at the absolute peak of his dominance, and in its place arise four horns, the four generals who divided the empire after his death: Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. Why does this matter for the history of Iran in the Bible? Because it shows that in Daniel's prophetic vision, Persia is not a secondary detail. It is one of the two great world powers that define the structure of pre-Messianic history: the ram and the goat, Persia and Greece. And between these two empires, in the interval between the Persian ram and the Greek goat, lived the people of God. The Jews existed as a restored nation, with a temple, with walls, with identity, because Persia allowed it. And they were forced to fight for cultural survival when Greece tried to Hellenize them by force, which led to the Maccabean revolt. Persia protected, Greece attacked. And Daniel saw both things before either happened. But Persia's influence on the Bible goes beyond kings, decrees, and prophecies about empires. There is a dimension that almost no one discusses, and which, once you understand it, changes the way you read practically the entire New Testament. During the nearly 2 centuries that the Jews lived under Persian rule and influence, from Cyrus's decree in 539 until Alexander's conquest in 331, something happened to Jewish theology, something profound. Before the Babylonian exile and the Persian period, the oldest Hebrew texts speak of God in an almost monolithic way. Angels appear, but without names. Life after death is vague. Sheol, a place of shadows where everyone goes, righteous and unrighteous. Satan appears in the book of Job not as a cosmic enemy, but as a member of the celestial court, almost a divine prosecutor. There is no clear doctrine of bodily resurrection. After the Persian period, all of this changes. Suddenly, angels have names: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Suddenly, there is a clear cosmic struggle between forces of good and forces of evil. Suddenly the idea of a final judgment, of the resurrection of the dead, of eternal reward for the righteous and punishment for the wicked, emerges. And do you know which religion already taught all these things centuries earlier? Zoroastrianism, the religion founded by Zarathustra in ancient Persia. Zoroastrianism taught that the world was a battlefield between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of evil and lies. It taught that at the end of time there would be a universal resurrection and a final judgment. It taught that angels, called Amesha Spentus, had names and specific functions. It taught the existence of a paradise and a hell. This does not mean the Jews simply copied Persian theology. That is a gross simplification that ignores the complexity of theological development. But most scholars, both secular and religious, recognize that prolonged contact with Persian culture acted as a catalyst. The seeds already existed in the oldest Hebrew texts, but it was in Persian soil that they germinated and grew. Daniel, living in the Persian court, is the prophet who speaks most about resurrection in the Old Testament. Daniel 12:2. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. That sentence, written within the Persian Empire, sounds strangely familiar to any Christian, because it is the theological foundation upon which Jesus would build all his teaching about eternal life, judgment, and resurrection. Persia did not invent these ideas for the Jews, but it was in Persia that these ideas found the language, structure, and urgency that would define Second Temple Judaism, and, by extension, Christianity. And speaking of Christianity, it is time to talk about the most direct, visible, and ignored moment of Persian presence in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Wise men, in Greek, Magi. And you know where that word comes from? From Old Persian, Magush. It was the title of the Zoroastrian priests of ancient Persia and Media. The three wise men everyone knows from Christmas were not kings, and the Bible never says there were three. It only mentions three gifts. What the Bible says is that they were Magi, Persian priests, scholars of the stars, coming from the east. Think about what that means. The first non-Jews to recognize the birth of Jesus, the first Gentiles to kneel before the Messiah, were Iranians, Persians, men who likely followed the Zoroastrian tradition, who studied the scriptures of Zarathustra, who came from a culture that for centuries had taught about the struggle between light and darkness, about a future savior, about the final victory of good. And these men traveled more than 1,500 kilometers, crossing deserts, mountains, and borders, to kneel before a Jewish baby in a manger in Bethlehem. The gifts they brought are revealing. Gold, a gift for a king. Frankincense, a gift for a deity. Myrrh, used in embalming, a gift that anticipates death. Three gifts that summarize Jesus' entire life before he even spoke his first word. And it was Persians who understood this. Not the priests of Jerusalem, not the teachers of the law, not the Pharisees who knew every comma of the Hebrew scriptures. It was foreigners coming from Iran. The irony is so dense it could be an entire chapter of theology. The Jewish Messiah, expected for centuries by Israel, was first recognized by priests of a Persian religion. And here is a political context almost no one mentions. At the time of Jesus' birth, the east from which the Magi came was no longer the Persian Empire of the Achaemenids. It was the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were an Iranian people who had retaken control of the region after the Greek domination of the Seleucids. And the Parthian Empire was the only military power in the world that rivaled Rome. The two empires faced each other regularly in Mesopotamia. In 53 BC, just a few decades before the birth of Jesus, the Parthians had crushed 7 Roman legions at the Battle of Carrhae, killing the Roman general Crassus and capturing the legionary eagles. It was one of the worst military defeats in Rome's history. Now imagine the scene in Jerusalem when the Magi arrived. Jerusalem was Roman territory. Herod ruled as a client king of Rome, and suddenly, priests from the Parthian Empire, Rome's greatest enemy, appear asking publicly, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews?" Matthew 2:2. That question was not just religious, it was a political bomb. Representatives of Rome's rival power were recognizing an alternative king in Roman territory. Matthew 2:3 says Herod was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Of course they were troubled. That could be the spark for a war. And what did Herod do? He ordered the killing of all male children in Bethlehem under the age of 2. The massacre of the innocents. Motivated in part by the political terror that an Iranian power was recognizing a rival to his throne. Once again, Persia, Iran, is at the center of an event that shaped biblical history in ways almost no one recognizes. The Persian Magi were not just nice visitors bringing Christmas presents. Their arrival triggered a political crisis that forced Jesus' family to flee to Egypt, turning the Messiah into a refugee before he was 2 years old. And the relationship between Persia and Christianity did not end at the manger. It continued for centuries. When Christianity began to spread outside the Roman world, one of the first places it reached was precisely the Parthian Empire, Iran. Tradition attributes the evangelization of Persia to the apostles Thomas and Thaddeus. The Church of the East, sometimes called the Nestorian Church, flourished in Persian territory and became one of the greatest missionary forces in history. At its peak, between the 7th and 14th centuries, this church, founded on Iranian soil, stretched from Syria to China. It had millions of faithful. It produced theologians, translators, and doctors. It preserved Greek texts that otherwise would have been lost. And it all began in Iran. Now step back for a moment and try to see the complete picture. Iran in the Bible is not a footnote. It is one of the guiding threads of the entire narrative. Cyrus freed the Jews and allowed the temple to be rebuilt. Without that, Judaism as we know it would not exist. Esther and Mordecai saved the Jewish people from genocide within the Persian Empire. Without that, the lineage that produced Jesus would not exist. Daniel received the most detailed prophetic visions of the Old Testament while living under Persian rule. Contact with Persian culture helped shape theological concepts that would become central to Christianity: resurrection, final judgment, angels, and demons. And Persian priests were the first Gentiles to recognize the Messiah. When you put all these facts together, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Uncomfortable for those who see the world in terms of us against them. Uncomfortable for those who want to divide history into permanent heroes and villains. The truth is that the civilization today, painted as the existential enemy of the West, and Israel is the same civilization that saved the Jews, protected their faith, shaped their theology, and recognized their Messiah. Modern Iran and biblical Iran seem like two different planets, but they are the same soil, the same mountains, the same plateau between the Tigris and the Indus where Cyrus rode, where Esther risked her life, where Daniel saw visions, where Magi read stars. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Bible offers when it mentions Iran. That history is longer than the news reports. That yesterday's alliances can be today's conflicts, and today's conflicts can be tomorrow's alliances. That an entire people cannot be reduced to its current government, just as the Persia of Cyrus cannot be reduced to the Persia of Haman. Within the same empire, in the same century, arose the man who freed the Jews and the man who tried to exterminate them. Good and evil are not divided by national borders. They never were. And the Bible, written millennia ago, already knew this. 3,000 years of history, two peoples intertwined in ways that neither can erase no matter how hard they try. And it is all recorded in a book that billions consider sacred. The next time you hear the word Iran in the news, remember, you are hearing about the land of Cyrus, the anointed of God, the land of Esther, the queen who saved her people, the land of Daniel, the prophet who saw the end of times, the land of the Magi, who were the first to kneel before Christ. This story is not buried, it is alive. In every page of the Bible that mentioned Persia, it is shouting a truth that we need to hear again. No people is only what they seem to be today. If you have made it this far, click on the video appearing on your screen now. I have set it aside especially for those who watch this one until the end.